News. You are fake news.
Fake oder Fakt? Echt oder manipuliert? Wahr oder gelogen?
Ist ein Fake?
Fake.
Das könnte echt sein.
Der Begriff Fake News ist schon ein Widerspruch in sich, denn News sind immer noch das beste Mittel, um gegen Fakes anzugehen und sie auch zu enttarnen. Aber wovon wir hier reden, sind nicht per se illegale Inhalte, aber eine gewisse Manipulation, ganz bewusst und mit einem entweder wirtschaftlichen, politischen oder anderen Interessensziel.
Fake News sind teilweise oder komplett erfunden, absichtlich im Netz verbreitet, mit dem Ziel, die öffentliche Meinung zu beeinflussen. Ganz aktuell geschehen in Chemnitz. Der Tod eines 35-jährigen Deutschen wird instrumentalisiert, um mit gefälschten Meldungen Stimmung gegen Ausländer zu machen. Posts von einem zweiten Todesopfer, sexuellen Belästigungen werden tausendfach bei Facebook und Twitter geteilt, obwohl die Polizei dementiert.
Irgendwann weiß man nicht mehr auseinanderzuhalten, was ist Wirklichkeit, was ist vorgemacht, was ist Fake.
Also ich glaube, dass viele Fake News sind, um die Bevölkerung aufzuhetzen.
Wenn man dann bedenkt, dass Menschen ja ihre Meinung aufgrund von Informationen bilden und auch Wahlentscheidungen treffen aufgrund von solchen Informationen und es entsteht irgendwann ein verzerrtes Bild, dann ist es wirklich eine Gefahr für unsere Demokratie.
Nicht nur Fotos oder Posts können inzwischen gefälscht werden, sondern auch Videos. Das Resultat: sogenannte Deepfakes.
President Trump is a total and complete dipshit.
Täuschend echt, doch mit einer Software gefaked.
Grundsätzlich braucht es einfach einen Rahmen, innerhalb dessen auch die Plattformen ihre Verantwortung anerkennen, in gewisser Weise auch eine übergeordnete Überwachung, denn ich glaube, das können die Plattformen selbst nicht leisten. Die Schwierigkeit ist bei der Form von Fake News, über die wir hier sprechen, die sind ganz schwer greifbar. Und wenn man die auf der einen Seite bekämpfen will, trägt man auf der anderen Seite auch das Risiko, dass es zu einem Overblocking oder einer Art Zensur kommt. Das darf natürlich auch nicht geschehen.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us, and thank you to Sonja and her team at NTV for the introductory video. We kind of almost felt that fake news didn't need much of an introduction. It seems like the only thing that most of us have been talking about over the last 18 months, 2 years. And I'd be willing to bet my entire life savings and my house on the fact that every person in this room in some way or another has been involved in fighting fake news and not becoming part of the problem. That's the first issue that we all face as broadcasters. But today we wanted to have a look at whether or not it was feasible for broadcast organizations, journalistic organizations, to actually become part of the solution. We've already heard from the President of Lithuania this morning, and we have some even better informed people on the subject who are going to be giving us their views and opinions and specialist insider knowledge. First is Marc Schreuder, who is the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of RTL News Netherlands. We have Olaf Steenfadt of the Reporters Without Borders organization. Olaf has a background in investigative journalism himself, but now is the project director on something called the Journalism Trust Initiative, which we'll come to in a short while. And Sonja Schwetje, who most of you will know, is the editor-in-chief of NTV, but is also the representative of RTL Group on the high-level expert group, which is an organization that has been put together by the European institutions in an attempt to find if there is some common ground to look at how the kind of regulation of the social media platforms more widely could be brought into practice if there was an appetite for that. So in the first instance, Sonja is going to talk us through the work of the high-level group.
Yeah, where Olaf was also a member, I have to add. So, yeah, I don't want to bore you because we've heard a lot about fake news and the definition of fake news, and I think when I talked to a lot of people also yesterday, I felt that there was great interest to getting into the discussion, but I think it is important, and that's exactly what the basis for our work in the high-level group was as well, to get clear understanding what are we talking about in this small group, because the term fake news, as it is, that is something that is commonly used for everything. And yesterday in the discussion on the panel, on cyber attacks, I already realized that there were some things mixed up. First of all, the term, and that was something that we discussed as a basic in the high-level group as well, fake news is something that is completely stupid and we shouldn't use it, but it is used so often and everybody uses it, so online disinformation really doesn't sound like something that you can use in a discussion. But in terms of news, I think this is the best way to fight fakes. And what did we think of in our group? The European Commission asked us to evaluate the scope of the problem connected with the term of fake news, and of course, as we all know, there are no easy solutions, but they brought together a lot of stakeholders, broadcasters, independent journalists, also fact-checking organizations, Reporters Without Borders, for example, but also the platforms were part of the work because we felt it is a societal problem and we all have to work on finding solutions. What we mean is not per se illegal content, as you've heard in the video, because there are laws against that, and the problem that arises there is how can people who claim there is illegal content get their right, for example, the right of reply. But we're talking about not journalists' mistakes, which according to Reuters Digital Institute, for example, a lot of people in the European Union mix up with fake news. So, of course, we have to do our work thoroughly, but this is not what we mean with fake news here. What we mean is intentionally manipulated content with a political or economical goal, for example. So the scope of the problem has risen. The problem itself has always been there, and we've talked about that yesterday as well. It is the core of the journalist job to find out what is true and what is not, and how can you detect the truth, and how can you tell people about it. But the dimension has been a different one during the last years due to technology. That is how fake news stories were disseminated in earlier times, and nowadays through algorithms it has become a massive problem where already the amount of fake news and the technology aspect makes it much harder for journalists just to do their job. And we also know that a lot of people, for example, who are in certain filter bubble, maybe even if you tell them we debunked this story and we found out another fact that actually shows you that this is a lie, they still want to believe what they had believed before, and it doesn't really matter, you don't reach them with facts anymore. So this is where the European Union found it very important to find solutions, and it is also important to notice that it was not regulation in the first place. We were actually getting together to find a solution which maybe was less regulation for broadcasters, because sometimes broadcasters are hindered in the way they work through regulation. Regulation doesn't always necessarily have to be the solution. The other problem is that algorithms help target people who easily want to believe manipulated content, and as we've heard yesterday as well, it is even part of their business model, because the most content that gets likes and shares is not reflected journalistic content, which is impartial, but it is something that is biased and that really provokes emotion. So that is part of the problem. What we tried to find out, we met in subgroups, we didn't have much time, of course, and in the end the task was to produce a report which has been published. You can all read it and find it in the internet, with recommendations for the European Commission that every stakeholder involved in the process could, commit to. Of course, maybe if the broadcasters were the only ones in that group, we had made different recommendations, stronger ones. But we wanted to have the platforms with us in the boat, and we wanted to find political solutions that are binding, but that are societal solutions. So what we thought was very important is that whatever comes out of the process, and it will be a process that goes hopefully into the next year and much further, although there will be a new commission. We try to build a pipeline into the next commission, that there must be some kind of framework, whether you call it regulation or legislation or whatever, but that holds true for all platforms. And it cannot be the solution that every platform has a way of interpreting the framework for themselves, as we cannot do that for our regulation as broadcasters. For example, RTL Group cannot say we interpret the principle of impartiality in this and that way, and so a lot of time will pass if whatever regulation body can state this is not the way we interpreted it. So there must be a binding framework that goes for every platform. Also, what we tried to establish were some principles. There's one missing. I think that's responsibility. Yeah, okay, there it is. You can get them. Oh yeah, there they are. What cannot be the solution is that there is someone looking at all the content on the platforms and evaluating this is good content and this is bad content. This cannot be. We don't want content police or something like that, so that must be avoided in any case. But of course there are some principles that can be hold true and that can be appreciated also by the platforms. Accountability is something when you have a certain influence. We have influence if we are part of mass media, but the platforms undisputable have influence as well. And so there has to be some kind of accountability. They have to acknowledge that they are also responsible, which they try or they tend to do right now, but 1, 2, 3 years ago, they didn't even acknowledge that they had a responsibility at all. They said, okay, we're free from every responsibility. It's not our fault when something that happens on our platforms. We're just the technology providing opportunities for anybody who wants to place content on the platforms. Transparency is a big thing. Also, we were discussing with the platforms because they argue that transparency is part of their business models, so that is something they didn't really want to be looked into. And of course, a lot of people do not have the deep understanding of how exactly algorithms work. But it must be possible to get a little bit more transparency and a little bit more warning, more time of warning. What happens if you alter your algorithm? What happens with news content, for example, with journalistic content? How can you make sure that there will be high quality content that can be found? Because that is something we cannot really influence ourselves. And of course, there must be transparency of, is this a real account? Is this a bot? Or where does the person disseminating some kind of content comes from? It does make a difference if somebody comes from the region where a political issue is being discussed or from another region, and that indicates that might be another interest behind the content that is being liked or shared or disseminated. Also, we have to talk about media literacy programs. Just in order to make sure people using platforms are aware of the problem. We are aware of the problem and we try our best to be transparent in our shows. For example, at RTL, at NTV, we do that more than we did that before. We try to explain how we go about our work and why certain rumors, for example, can pop up, although we have debunked them already. And we also show people that although there is not a single bit of truth in one story, still people are talking about the story and still believe the story. So also transparency from our side in order to foster media literacy maybe. But on the other hand, of course, as we've heard, the great problem is it must not lead to overblocking. We have a law in Germany that was the first step, and in the beginning we had the problem that due to the formulation that potentially illegal content must be taken from the platforms, that has led to situations where platforms eliminated content with no transparency, by the way, which was not illegal, which was parody, satire, or journalistic content. So that is one backdraft, and we have to keep that very, very intensely in mind, and censorship, of course. So, yeah, that's maybe an introduction to the discussion. As far as our work in the high-level group goes, we had, in our report, made some recommendations, and one of them was that the platforms should develop a code of practice that applies some of the principles that we of mass media also adhere to. And that was presented in September. So actually, we looked into it, and I think Olaf has an opinion on that. And usually, the way was that we should evaluate the effectiveness of the code of practice, and then whether that is effective or not, there should be next steps by the European Commission that might lead to other forms of regulation, or maybe if the result is okay, that's fine, the code of practice works and there's no need for further action, then that was it. So just as an introduction for the discussion.
Thank you very much. So just to kind of simplify and perhaps oversimplify, but I'm a journalist, that's what I do. This is a system that's being looked at whereby we potentially black mark bad actors in the field. Yeah, we look at people who are doing things that don't conform to accepted guidelines or ways of behavior, and we look at ways of dealing with those people. In parallel to that is another process that Olaf is leading on behalf of Reporters Without Borders, which is kind of the converse. This is a white tick system. So perhaps if you could talk us through, Olaf, and then we can get into the discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I guess you're not surprised a lot that a press freedom watchdog and human rights NGO is also concerned with this strange thing formerly known as fake news. We also try to avoid this term for the reasons that were just mentioned, but also for one more reason, which is that this very term is used and weaponized against us, against journalists, or Lügenpresse, the same. And as we protect and defend journalists and journalism worldwide, and this is really seen and felt as an attack against our trade and profession, we thought we might and should engage. What might surprise you a little bit more is in thinking and wondering what we could do, we actually came up with a pretty much, I would say, economic angle to the problem, because we began also by means of our contribution and participation in the high-level group that it is obviously almost impossible to sustain independent journalism, which we fight for, if the media landscape is falling apart. Or to put it another way around, a healthy media landscape seems to be a prerequisite for independent journalism. And speaking about independent and professional working journalism, and this is, I would say, our point of departure, we believe while many others are chasing the bad, we would like to support the good and find a way to incentivize and reward journalism worthy of its name. And this is more or less what the Journalism Trust Initiative is all about. And I can maybe give you a little bit of an idea what we are currently implementing and why we are doing this. And yeah, please forgive me, I'm also a journalist for this kind of simplistic presentation. But if you look at it, I mean, the workflow we are dealing with on a daily basis, we see a lot of initiatives around fact-checking, mushrooming all around us. And also at RSF, we've been invited to participate in most of them. And I must say that even though well-intentioned, we have a number of, let's say, questions or concerns with fact-checking. One is scalability. Given the amount of garbage out there, would it be possible to fact-check most of it? And I'm not only talking about amounts, but also complexity of falsehoods to debunk. The second question or problem we have is what's sometimes referred to as confirmation bias. So if somebody really believes in a conspiracy theory or falsehood, and you come around the corner with facts trying to convince this person of the opposite and that he or she is wrong, how successful will this be? Or can this even make things worse and reinforce the belief in the falsehoods? And the last concern maybe is the fact that fact-checking always comes late, when the falsehood is already out there, ex post, trying to deal with it. And frankly, also speaking as a journalist, I believe fact-checking is part of our profession in the first place. If something is not fact-checked, it's not journalism. And any notion according to which you can kind of extract the fact-checking part from journalism and put it on later, and this seems to be happening all around us, seems to be really devaluating our profession. What also we see being not only developed but actually being implemented are lots and lots of tools, mainly apps and technological tools around the final product, rating, ranking, judging, annotating content. Again, and this relates to what Sonja just said, where we believe even if, in the best of cases, these instruments may work in some countries and environments, we have a strong fear that they can be easily misused and turned into censorship in other places as well. Just to give you one maybe very specific example, I was attending a conference in the US lately, MISINFOCON, where lots and lots of these products were launched and presented, for example, about clickbait. And there is the, I think, intellectual understanding, which we can all subscribe to, that clickbait is bad because it actually monetizes bad actors, maybe. But at the same time, I was thinking to myself, kind of, well, wasn't journalism always a little bit about clickbait? I mean, because we have to sell, right? First, as a journalist, you have to sell to your editor, and then the editor and your publishing group or broadcaster to market. And of course, you kind of pimp your story a little bit. And if, say, there would be a tool out there by technology, erasing all sensationalism and clickbait to zero, just imagine, I think journalism would taste like zero-fat milk. It would be totally boring. And so it's about, you know, not a binary problem, but if you apply technology to this, it really can easily become one and make things worse. So with a strong knowledge and understanding what we don't want to do, again, the question was on the table, what can we do? And we ended up in this kind of process level, the recipe or the oven where journalism is being produced, and I guess where most of you work. And we asked ourselves, how can we safeguard independence of journalism on this process level? Again, we are not talking about individual pieces of content, articles, because that can easily produce censorship, and we believe it's wrong. But how can we define and safeguard criteria that, let's say, define an enabling environment for our profession? And this is basically what the Journalism Trust Initiative is all about. And more practically, if you ask yourselves, what are we talking about? This could be anything from complaint and correction mechanisms, the ratio of original production, transparency of funding, sources of revenues, ownership, etc. Now, knowing that if we speak, for example, about editorial guidelines and ethical codes, that all of this exists mostly. There is definitely no shortage. And as we don't want to reinvent the wheel, we really have to emphasize that this is not so much about drawing up a new ethical code, but the problem seems compliance. And this is exactly the additional layer we would like to add to existing editorial guidelines and ethical codes. Now, in doing this, we came across a quite maybe even bizarre and strange instrument, which is standard setting. And when I say standards, I mean the ISO, the official standard thing, for a number of reasons. ISO standards are already a tested instrument. I guess most of your companies already use standards in many, many domains, in accounting, in technical domains like broadcasting signals, publishers with paper printing quality, CSR, waste management, you name it. So it's already in the DNA of most companies. And it's scalable. We work now together with the European Committee of Standardization, which is the subsection of ISO in Europe, and they publish 15,000 standards a year. Even more important, we believe, is the mechanism is self-regulatory. A standard, per definition, is the opposite of a law. It's the industry getting its act together. And of course, it's voluntary. Nobody is forced to use and implement a standard. And even more importantly, it's based on incentives, because if something is voluntary, you need a benefit, you need a reason. Why should you invest in such a standard? And there are a number of incentives we discovered and we believe are very relevant in this particular domain. The whole notion of standard setting is to preempt legislation, as said, as an industry to get its act together before some crazy laws come about. And I think particularly in our industry, we are just exactly at the moment in time where there is elevated appetite in political quarters to do something quick. And so this is, I think, a big motif and motivation. The second one, which we also see in different industries and also which is really part of the standard setting thinking, it limits liability. So if you comply with voluntary industry standards, your liability in legal terms is lower. And maybe even more importantly, it should sell. And what I mean by this is that we have discovered in looking at this kind of trust equation, it's not only us, the media, and the consumers or citizens, but it's also the advertisers facing the same dilemma as they try to identify safe environments online, where the latest chocolate bar or Mercedes or whatever would not pop up next to child porn or IS recruitment or hate speech. And practically there is no instrument existing automatically, and this is how advertising online works, to secure this. And this is maybe the whole logic of the project. If we can align advertising spending with the compliance to ethical and professional norms of our profession, it can then remonetize journalism worthy of its name. And this is how we have set up the project with the European Committee of Standardization. It is mostly us and ourselves, journalists, but not only. We have platforms involved, we have advertisers involved, regulatory authorities, governments, press councils, unions, so a pretty wide group of stakeholders to basically draw up these criteria to be then enshrined in a standard. And Marc is participating on behalf of not only the RTL group, but also ENEX and contributing a lot. We've had our first official workshop last week in Paris and expect to publish hopefully by the end of next year. I'm not going to go into much more details how the work is being structured, how the topical, as we call it, drafting committees are being designed, but if you feel like joining or be interested in it, you can of course refer to me or Marc at any time. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. And I will get to questions. I'm sure there's going to be plenty. But first of all, I just want to come to the usually shy Marc Schreuder.
Absolutely.
To look at we all do what we can do every day in our newsrooms, Marc, not to be part of the problem. We verify, we fact check, we do our journalism with the usual rigor. But this kind of material is threatening democracy, it's threatening our revenue structures, it's threatening our audiences. It's self-evident, isn't it, that we need to be part of the solution as well? We need to take action.
Yeah, by journalism first, as you said, but what I find complex is that because of the fake news discussion, we are forced into a way of working together with politicians, institutions, and we are journalists. We should be independent. We shouldn't be part of setting new rules, new guidelines, legislation, whatever. So that I find that really very complex. Why are we working together with politicians who, in the end, also are part of the problem? I mean, against one journalist, there are 10 press officers these days. They are manipulating the information flows. They don't give answers. So I think the problem is not cooperating with them, but fighting them with good journalism.
Okay, but if they are going to be going down these avenues, do they not need us there to guide them in what we feel are the correct directions?
Yeah, but I think by writing good articles, making good pieces in our bulletins about what's happening within Facebook, for example, who's really digging into Facebook and the algorithms they have there, and telling the world about what's happening. I think we should put our efforts in that and not into working together with politicians again.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have kind of three representative avenues there, not necessarily supported personally by the people who've been speaking to them. I have to say that people came to represent the different processes that they're taking part in. I just have one more question. Olaf, you referenced revenue and incentives and so forth. Do you see a way in which that specific scheme could be used to buy the platforms to bring people up in searches and so forth? Is that a possible incentive for us?
Definitely yes. I think in quick response to what you just said, I think maybe just to correct misunderstanding, we are not working with politicians, quite the opposite, because again, this is about preempting legislation. However, I personally these days find some politicians maybe even more helpful than the platforms. Also in terms of size, I mean, both Google and Facebook are much larger than this country or other countries in the European Union and not accountable to anyone. And this is, I think, also the main task, because the question is not whether or not it's a good idea to have these indicators. I mean, this is what we're talking about, right? Signals to inform search ranks, I mean algorithms then producing search ranks and news feeds. These indicators exist already as we speak. They are drawn up and tweaked on a daily basis somewhere in California by tech people. And our belief is that it should be us, the journalists, to define these signals, or at least the set of criteria for these signals, then informing algorithmic decision making. So this is more or less behind the whole idea. And coming back to platforms, I think over the course of developing and launching this project, the notion has changed a lot. And I think also our experience with the high-level group was kind of, at least my personal experience, that they couldn't care less. Platforms, I mean, they showed up, but that was about it. And by now, I think they have much more pressure in many, many ways, so they contribute and they take it seriously. And I think, I mean, they tell us if there is a universal accepted set of criteria for journalism sources, again, I'm not talking about pieces of content, but sources, we would love to take it on immediately.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe just adding to your argument, I totally agree that we are journalists and we have more important work to do than go to Brussels and spend hours and hours and hours there. And
that's from bitter experience, obviously.
But
yes.
Times have changed, and you know that Facebook, especially, and Google, the big platforms, have armies of lobbyists. They have the best from all countries. They have lawyers, they have money, they have expertise, they have former high-ranking employees of politicians. So I totally agree, we are not working with the legislative, but they are forming a basis, and now it is time to collect information, and the competence and knowledge of what is going on nowadays in terms of fake news or online disinformation is totally different. Not every politician in Brussels is as well informed as somebody else. What we try to do is to show what the platforms do anyway. They do it throughout the year, not only in working groups. They send people to Brussels, they have expenditures, they invite people for dinners and stuff like that. We don't want to go there. But we need to show them our arguments. And this is very important because our aim is that we can have and foster a media landscape where people will for a long time be able to get informed properly and to base their choices on informed information and on qualified information. So this is why we think it's important just to make sure that not only the platforms influence those, and we always tell them it is your job to find which way of regulation will be suitable. And it is per se the platform's job to propose something, but the quality of their proposals is poor, and I agree with you on that.
A question to you, because setting standards will mean that, that I have to apply for an ISO certification or something like that. But if I don't tick all 10 boxes, but only 9, so I won't get a certificate, will I then be a not verified media brand, and will that mean that I will bring bad journalism?
Well, again, we are in this whitelisting logic. We are supporting the good, and we are not judging those who are not applying or going through the process. Yeah. But this is one reason why we sorted the whole thing in 3 different levels, also to provide different kind of entry levels for media outlets. And just to give you one quick example, the first and basic one is only about ownership transparency. And it's interesting, in almost any talk or discussion we have, at one point Russia Today comes up, like the litmus test. And frankly speaking, Russia Today is perfectly transparent about its ownership and revenues. If you want to know who is behind Russia Today, who is owning and funding it, no big deal. Whereas in Germany, where I come from, our #1 quality daily, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, nobody knows who owns it. There's some foundation behind, and that's about it. So I think talking about standards, we also have to avoid double standards. And in this particular domain of ownership transparency, it doesn't even need certification. It's just per declaration only. So you can compare it to nutrition facts on the packaging of food. And if it's a Mars bar, which is just sugar and fat, at least you know. So it's totally non-judgmental. And of course, if we then speak about the second and third batch of standards, which are about methods and ethics, that's of course much more complex. And I'm not predicting, but Russia Today, if they would go for these levels, who knows?
Yeah. But aren't you afraid that diversity in journalism will disappear? Because some parties won't be able to tick all the boxes.
Well, I mean, closest to our heart at RSF, I think, are the vulnerable, small media outlets everywhere. And we honestly believe that they will benefit from this most. I think the New York Times has other means, or the BBC, to get the message across that they should be trusted. But the smaller or smallest media outlets, or even a singular blogger, how can they get the message across? And if you look in, sometimes listen to myself, it sounds a bit like the preacher of the Church of Standards. I'm not, but I'm looking at it as a journalist. But if you research a little bit on the history of standardization, it's not Siemens. It's the SMEs, the small companies protecting their innovation and patents by means of standardization. And this makes us confident that those in our industry will benefit most from this.
Yeah, but my problem is that journalism, you can't. I mean, it's not like a telephone or something that should work in a certain way. I mean, journalism is so diverse, and people. So you understand that? How do you standardize journalism?
We don't. We just say we need certain criteria and indicators to be fed into algorithmic decision making, self-regulated and developed by us, the journalistic profession, rather than anyone else. And it's not perfect, I know. I think the whole domain, as we discussed and experienced everywhere, of online disinformation is contradictory. It is messy. Yeah. And obviously also solutions will be maybe contradictory and messy. I'm afraid, yes.
Okay. Perhaps, do we have some questions from the floor? I know this is a subject that ignites a lot of passion. Ivania?
What will be the quick definition for each of you on fake news? What makes it fake news?
Maybe I can start. That's actually something that I always use in this respect. What we're talking about is fake news is deliberately manipulated content for a purpose, political, economical, whatever.
In the literature, I think also we use in the high-level group, there is the distinction between disinformation, misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And more or less, I think that the major difference is it on purpose or not? But that's difficult to distinguish, and I think there is no real, line you can draw. Take the red 350 million Brexit bus. I mean, the message on the bus probably was false from the beginning and people who put it on the bus knew about it. But if you say it was on purpose to cause harm, they would probably argue we did it to avoid harm. So the purpose thing is really a slippery slope, I think, also in academia struggling.
I agree with both speakers. So.
Okay. Well, perhaps before we go any further then, just a quick show of hands. Who in the room thinks that as news organisations we need to be doing something more other than just verifying the pictures that we put out and making sure that we're not disseminating fake news? Who thinks we should do more? Okay. And those who feel very strongly that we shouldn't? Okay. Andy, do you have any insight that you want to share?
Well, I think a lot of what Olaf was talking about, CBS News already does. We already have our own internal self-regulation, CBS News standards that have been established since the General Westmoreland case back in the 1970s sort of thing, So we've had standards that have come out from that. For Sonja, I was kind of intrigued with one thing that you said. You said that if it had been the broadcasters who have done the report, it would have been different.
Yes.
So was the report watered down to a point of being pointless because the social media platforms were part of the discussion? And as we know, they can't self-regulate themselves.
It was watered, yes, if you compare it to a broadcaster only, but I think it's not ineffective. It's probably more effective if you take in all the stakeholders, and the platforms are the most important ones. There is no need in formulating something that we might want, because then it would have been looking like, okay, they are your competitors, you don't come up with the useful business models, that's what we always hear. So that would have been useless. We could have written anything we wanted, our own position, which is known, but it wouldn't have been useful. So I think it's useful, and the report does have an effect. But yes, we would have formulated some recommendations much stronger.
What were the specifics that they were watering down? What didn't they like that you were proposing?
I am not allowed to speak about that because that was part of the deal, that we did not talk about the discussions we had in the subgroups.
But maybe in a more general sense, one can say that from the very beginning, I think we all understood that there is, even though the task was to inform political decision-making in Brussels, there was very little political will to regulate platforms. That was, I think, clear from the start, particularly as the only really meaningful leverage the Commission has, and that's competition, was taken off the table from day one. And if you leave that, what can the Commission do on that?
Is that because of the threat of legal action, because of all the whining and dining that they do, that they've got such influence there that there is nobody with the political will to stop them?
I mean, Cambridge Analytica happened exactly 1 week after the release of our report, and I believe if it would have happened during our deliberations, probably the result would have been different, not only from the group, but also from what the Commission thinks.
I think the pressure grew, also because the kind of fake news that we were dealing with was, again, you have to differentiate between illegal content. What we're talking about is something that is really hard to grasp, something that is a little bit of the truth combined in with lies or in a wrong context. So people who feel that they are not, their view is not reflected in the right way, where can they turn to? If not, maybe some authorities, if they fail at the platforms themselves.
Ralph? Hold on 1 second.
What I'm missing a bit in the whole discussion is that I think the quality of journalism is going down permanently. We have a generation of copy-paste journalism, partly, and I don't think it needs standards. It needs simply more quality in the journalism again. That's a question of economic, I know, but I think we took out the relevant out of the news partly. A lot of newscasts are opinion. It had nothing to do with facts anymore. It's pure opinion. And that has no relevance. And why somebody should look at that? If it has no relevance, it has no investigation anymore. It's just easy job every day, news agency, some pictures, done. And I miss that. And I think the audience itself miss it. So it's not, you don't see it anymore. So what you do, you go to the internet and search what you can find. And the broadcasters, I think, they kill themselves a little bit with this policy.
I completely disagree, actually. I have to say that first. I don't think the quality of journalism is going down.
When was the last
it's
investigative story on NTV? I cannot remember.
No, I'm not speaking for our own company. It's just a generalization. I mean, these times actually have great challenges for journalists, and a lot of people do their best to meet those challenges and train people and want to be trained. I have a lot of journalists, not only at NTV or RTL, but who want to be trained better, who come up to us and ask us, okay, what about verification? Do I need different tools to do my job properly? Because that changes. I wouldn't say that journalism as a whole industry, the quality is going down. There might be some points where you're right. I cannot say that, but in general there is a demand and a need of high quality journalism and a lot of talents who want to meet the demand.
I disagree, but everybody has an opinion.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, any more questions? No?
Yeah.
Yeah, please. Maria? Yep.
There is this difference between... Hello? No, okay. So in the beginning you mentioned that there is this big difference between fake news and mistakes in news, which is quite apparent, I think, for everybody here. But how to make this difference clear for the big audience? Because nowadays it's far too easy for certain groups, and I guess every country has, to point out any mistake in the news and shout loud that it's fake news and you shouldn't trust anything that mainstream media is saying. We see that everywhere. What to do to this? Thank you.
There are probably many ways, but I think one way is transparency about our own mistakes. Journalists are human beings, of course, and that's good. We're not bots. And journalists and human beings make mistakes. The question is, and that should differentiate us from the platforms, how transparent are we about our own mistakes? If we have sent out a message or a post or aired something in TV which later on turned out it was wrong, whatever, because by mistake or we had the wrong source, we should talk openly about it. We write an article on it, how did it come to this mistake, and we take responsibility, and this is what's the difference. We take responsibility for our own mistakes.
In our part in the project, the existence and also the let's say, quality of correction policies on the end of media outlets is objectifiable and we believe could be measured and also be put out in terms of transparency.
And Mark, your view is, I guess, that you just keep doing it and you keep doing it right, yeah?
Yeah, that's basically what it is. And be transparent if you do make mistakes.
Okay. Aaron.
I have more of a statement rather than a question. I also don't accept the fact that the quality of news is going down. I think that the requirement for news or for breaking news is going down because the consumer does not need us anymore to get his news. He gets it here. He needs us to get the verified news. He needs us to get his context, to get analysis, to get the augmented reality way of presenting the news. And I think this is where the future lies, more in opinionated news. Yes, not in impartial news. This is what this is where the future of the traditional media lies, as opposed to the other sources of information. You don't need the basic information. You don't have to wait for the basic information. And if we ourselves, I'm talking about myself, if we are to compete with Twitter and with the other means of getting information, we will lose. We will lose. We don't have the capacity to fight. This is why we have to fight for another form of news, processed form of news, and also for the experience of, or giving our consumers the experience of consuming the news in a different manner.
Okay, well, I'll turn it into a question then. Is it time to wave the white flag and cede the idea to other people that we are somehow responsible for bringing facts to the public? No? Is that no longer our responsibility? Should we just hire people who
we should
give their opinions
content,
about the news?
and I'm not sure what opinionated news is, what your definition of it is. I mean, we should bring stories where the different views and angles on topics are reflected, and that's our job. We could give context, and I think you're right that breaking news is less important for us as an industry. We should explain to our audiences what's happening in the world and what the relevance is for them in a personal lifestyle. But basically, that's our job, and we should do 100% the job. And if we make mistakes, be open about it. And if we see misinformation or disinformation, we should do something about it, write stories about it. I mean, Cambridge Analytica, a week too late for you and the expert group, but we should write more stories about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, so in the end, the problem will fade away.
That's a very good example, yeah. Olaf, does your process add anything to that?
Mel, maybe it sounds awfully technocratic, but when you speak about opinion pieces, again, I think that's one criteria to tag them clearly and distinguish. I mean, that's, I think, bread and butter for any journalist from the early days of journalism school onwards, to distinguish between news and opinion. But, you know, advertise it and tag it towards the audiences clearly is not always upheld. And this is also one criteria we might be putting up in our little exercise.
In terms of breaking news, since we're a news channel and breaking news is our DNA, we feel that it is even more important to be there, because whenever a situation breaks and nobody knows exactly what is happening, but everybody gets push messages and rumors on the platforms, we see that people turn to TV, classical TV, in order to be informed on time, within the process of the breaking news, and they appreciate that you tell them, okay, this is what we know for sure, and this is what we don't know. I know that people give that out for facts, but it's not true. A second attacker or another site of an attack or some other weapons or people arrested by the police or around in the country. And people want to know, and this is what they don't get on the internet, what is a fact and what is not. And this is why I think we will be needed in breaking news even more than in regular situations.
Can I comment?
Sure.
Well, regardless of the fact, I mean, there's no doubt that we have to stick to the facts. Nevertheless, I am sure that we are not a news channel, but we have many news channels in the room, and truth God, with a hand on your heart, could you say that you don't lower the standard of breaking news in order to feed your 24-hour news channel? Well, you know, and this is also, so it puts all journalistic assessments or journalistic editorial decisions in a very different perspective. Because something which is not necessarily breaking news on a daily or nightly news show would become a breaking news on a 24-hour news channel, and it will change the whole discourse. The standards will be lowered in order to feed the beast.
Okay, can I just clarify one thing? When you're talking about lowering the standards, do you mean you're talking about stories that you wouldn't ordinarily talk about on a bulletin program? You're talking about more stories? Okay, well, I think I just wanted to check that you weren't talking about lowering standards of accepting what was true and false.
No, definitely not. No.
I think that's an entirely different argument. That's a debate panel about the pros and cons of 24-hour news channels.
But it has its parallels and relations.
Okay, thank you. Lots of head nods. Andy, quick one.
Going going to be responsible using their own algorithms, or are they going to be responsible in putting humans in to look at the stories, the fake newses and such like? You know, they have armies of lawyers, but they don't seem to be employing enough humans to be able to cope with the amount of fake news that's out there to actually look at this. And they're still relying upon these algorithms that are causing all the problems in the first place.
I think that's part of our criticism right now on the way they take the responsibility. They said that they can have solutions, technology solutions. We feel that technology cannot solve all the problems. You need human beings. And they need to invest more in their own teams to get rid of things that bots, for example, cannot detect.
And how do you look at the fact-checking program that they do now with media companies all over the world? Facebook itself has this fact-checking program, working together with media brands all around Europe. And in the Netherlands, we have had the situation that for months there was only one party working with Facebook, a competitor, and they flagged us, they flagged other media brands for fake news, which was bad journalism, but not fake. How do you think?
Well, first of all, I think they should invest more in human beings trying to address the problem. For example, someone you can reach when you feel misrepresented, for example. And then secondly, it cannot be privatized. This is why we are critical towards that code of practice. If they are the ones responsible for overseeing their own courses of action and measuring their effectiveness, where's the incentive? So this is why I think there must be a kind of impartial body or something like that overseeing that.
And is there, I sense the kind of eagerness within media companies in Europe to finally, we have a weapon that we can fight Facebook. The invitation for the expert group. It is the only way we can fight actually Facebook, Google being dominant in our markets. Is it misused also, this expert group, do you think?
It's not fight, it's not fight. It's trying to find a solution for a democratic problem. We have a societal problem that belongs
It's not
to
an
us
economical
all.
problem for publishers in Europe, and this was the way out to fight Facebook?
I think perhaps before we get to that as a debate, we need to find out exactly what the end product of the process is going to be. But thank you. And thank you all very much. Unless it's fake news, I know Olaf has to make a dash to the airport. So thank you all very much for being so open and honest with us as whenever you could. And thank you for your questions.